Good afternoon and welcome to this second session of Leading for Change, the Big Collaboration. My name is Piers Ricketts. I'm Chief Executive of Eastern AHSN, and we are delighted to have been asked by the NHS Leadership Academy in the East of England to partner with them and the integrated care systems across our region to support the development of collaborative, compassionate and inclusive leadership across the developing ICSs. For those of you who don't know Eastern AHSN, this event is right up our street, as our purpose is to turn great ideas into positive health impact. We were established by the NHS to convene all partners in the health sector to deliver and develop innovative solutions across our health and care system. Our focus is obviously the East of England, but we are part of a national academic health science network which enables us to deliver at scale. We have a core role in the spread of integrated care by encouraging and enabling colleagues to remove traditional divisions and to develop a culture of innovation which will ultimately improve population health. This series of events is called The Big Collaboration, and it's been delivered virtually across 3 sessions. So today is the second. We're going to explore collective innovation, and we're going to look at some of the leadership skills and behaviours required to support the successful integrations of teams across the public sector, the third sector and the voluntary sector. We'll be celebrating the best practices already taking place across ICSs in the Glimpses of Brilliance sessions, as one of those that immediately follows this session now. And we have a range of workshops on innovations which we think can benefit both patients and our workforce. There'll also be an opportunity for you to get to know colleagues working across the region via our virtual networking function. And so in conclusion, we hope that this will be a timely opportunity for you to think about how you could do things differently, stimulate innovation, and rethink leadership behaviours to enable the development of collaborative system partnerships with our citizens at the heart. Bit of housekeeping, opportunities to interact, so you can submit your questions via the chat function. We'll answer as many as possible as the meeting progresses. And if you're ready to submit a question, please detail your name and organisation in your profile. Some of you may have attended last week, so this meeting series is run over 3 days. Each day has the same format of a plenary, which is now followed by the Glimpses of Brilliance sessions from the ICSs, and then followed by a selection of workshops, so that you can pick and choose whatever best suits you and your diary. You don't need to attend the whole programme, as some of the sessions are repeated to enable maximum access. And if an area interests you in particular, then message the speaker, and I'm sure that he or she will be up for a more detailed discussion in the virtual networking area, or maybe after the event. In terms of privacy, this is a closed meeting. Delegation is only for those who work in health and care. We're not recording this, but approved excerpts of presentations and quotes from the speakers will be shared on owned channels, including social media. So let's move now to today's plenary session, which is called The Development of Integrated Care Systems, Reorganisation or Revolution. And our panel is going to be introduced and facilitated by Alistair Mitchell-Baker. And Alistair is a founding director of Tricordant and an experienced consultant and organisational leader. Following a 15-year NHS career, including as a chief executive, Alistair specialises in supporting organisational leaders to navigate change with his experience in strategic management, organisational design and development. And he's led major assignments for local government, healthcare, commercial and not-for-profit clients. So Alistair's going to introduce the panel and they're going to get into discussion. So Alistair, take it away.
Well, thank you, Piers, and it's good to be with you today, this afternoon. And we've got a great panel to just explore this whole question around the development of integrated care systems. Just for those who don't know, integrated care systems are aiming at improving population health and healthcare, tackling health inequalities, improving access. They're helping to improve the productivity and value for money of healthcare provision. And also they're helping the NHS contribute to wider social and economic development. They are putting at the heart of how the NHS is working with other partners a duty to collaborate. And there's a whole set of legislation that's going through Parliament at the moment that will enact new integrated care systems on a statutory basis from next April. So I'm delighted that we're joined by a panel today. Let me introduce them. So delighted that Melanie Craig, who is the Accountable Officer for Norfolk and Waveney CCG, and also the Executive Lead for the Norfolk and Waveney Integrated Care System. We've also joined by Owen Mapley, Chief Executive of Hertfordshire County Council, by Dr. Jag Aluwale, who is the Chief Clinical Officer for Eastern Academic Health Science Network, who has a background as a secondary care consultant. And we're joined by Dr. Emma Tiffin, who is a GP and the mental health lead for Cambridge and Peterborough Integrated Care System. And finally, Simon Wood, who is the Director of Transformation and Strategy for NHS England, East of England. So what we're going to do in the next hour is give a chance to each panel member to say a bit about the question that we posed as a kickoff. We'll see if they've got any immediate responses to each other, but we'd really love to have questions from you, which if you could put that into the question on the line, and then we'll try and put that to the panel and see where we go. So, if those of you who were with us last week would have heard Professor Sir Muir Gray kick off the conference, and he said that integrated care systems, in his view, were potentially the third great revolution to hit the NHS. Well, is that the case or not? Let's see what our panelists think. So, Melanie, perhaps you could share with us to kick off our question for the day.
Thank you very much, Alistair. Yeah, great snappy title, snappy question. I actually think there probably are a few areas where we do need a bit of a revolution. Top of my list would be digital. Despite all of the massive transformation that we saw at the start of the pandemic, the scale and change of what is now needed is too big. It's too big, and we just won't be able to deliver that change unless we fundamentally change the way we're thinking. I would say that coming from one of the least digitally mature systems, but I'm speaking to fellow systems in that place as well who may recognise that. And I want to just take the opportunity while I'm talking about digital to plug the Digitise, Connect and Transform guidance, which was published just recently. It's in the 21-22 operating plan and in the ICS design framework. And I think that's going along absolutely the right line so that we do create some revolution and change in digital. My second point, where again, I think we need to revolutionise our thinking a little bit more, is when I look at areas that are performing really, really well, there's frequently a combination of factors, and it will include a local solution that takes a connection to the local social, to the local economy, and takes account of local social aspects. And I think within an ICS, that's the approach that we need to consider more frequently and systemise that. And if we continue to do that, to have a greater impact on the social setup and the economy, we'll also start to tackle health inequalities much more. So that's my second area for revolution. And lastly, what is key, absolutely key in integrated care systems is culture, relationships and behaviours. And that's both within the NHS and then between the NHS and social care and voluntary sector and district council partners. Getting people to think system can be a massive change. Completely goes against the point, is it a restructure? No, I absolutely don't think it is. But throughout the ICS, I think that relationships, behaviours and culture are king. So thank you, Alistair.
Thank you, Melanie. And I think that last point you've made about culture, I have heard reiterated so many times in conversations we've had. So thank you. I'd now like to invite Owen to give his perspective. Owen.
Thanks, Alistair. Good to see everybody. Very pleased to be part of this panel. Three quick points I want to make. A few reflections on my engagement in ICSs over the last couple of years. The first is there's been a lot of talk about integration between health and care, or health and social care. And whilst it's been great in many ways that despite the challenges and tragedies of the pandemic, the increased focus and awareness on social care, I'm delighted to see that. However, for me in ICSs, it's not solely about health and care, it's about collaboration between health and all of the partners, and councils in particular, the whole council, that we've got to really resist a sort of reductive focus on metrics, whether that be flow or discharge or so on, because the things that councils can bring to this party are so many of the things that contribute to the wider determinants, keeping people out of hospital, population preventative health approach, because all of the things that we can contribute around children and young people, criminal justice systems, housing, drug and alcohol, domestic abuse, planning, it all goes into that focus. So let's not just talk about integration between health and care, or health and adult care, or health and care homes. It's a whole council approach. Second point, delighted, speaking on behalf of all colleagues in local government, to see so much focus in much of the planning documentation and so on about the partnership of equals, parity of esteem, and that's so important, and that can be damaged just through careless language. I know of one system, I won't name it, but one system where they were talking about the development of the integrated care boards and the integrated care partnerships that come together to make up the ICS. And the phrase from a very senior NHS leader was, well, the ICB is the engine room of the ICS. And that immediately made me think, oh, it's all going to be about the operational bit of the NHS then, isn't it? Well, of course that's important, but I think this partnership of all of us working together on health and care within ICSs is crucial. And then third and final point, I'll just completely agree with what's already been said. This stuff is hard, and so let's not beat ourselves up, but let's look to learn and reflect and talk and relationship build. There are a lot of things that are changing all the time, new rules, new acronyms, new priorities, and difference. What's the difference between a NED in a trust and a councillor, say? Well, there's some similarities and differences. My plea would be, let's not focus on polishing the differences and using them as a reason for not collaborating, but let's all recognise we've got to do more to really focus on relationships and culture, because this is hard stuff.
Thanks, Owen. Absolutely, this is hard stuff, but critical if we're going to make that difference. Jack, would you like to share your perspective next, please?
Thanks very much, Alistair. So I'd agree with everything that's been said. I think there are elements that require considerable change, revolution almost, and some that require careful evolution. So I was coming up with something handy to think about. So I think ICSs represent a chance for synergistic outputs rather than just additive outputs. And I think a combination of considerate and considerable change is required. And I'd focus on 3 points. I think the one I'd start with, which I guess touches upon culture, is the need to build trustworthiness amongst all of us as partners, and for the medium to long term, and not just for 1 year or a convenient metric. And that involves a lot of give and take, I think, and allowing other partners' ideas to flourish and perhaps not to succeed, but to tolerate them and to encourage us all to be curious about how we can do things differently by default. The second, which I would wish to see, and I'm always concerned about big programs, is I think we really need to focus on a small number of programs that are going to be delivered in a time frame that is reasonable, so that we can all get strength and courage from the fact that we can do this together. So not allowing tens and tens of thousands of flowers to bloom, but perhaps a few selected flowers to bloom. And the one I would start with, I think, would be reducing undesirable variation of care and standardization. And as Melanie said, use technology perhaps to help some of that standardization agenda. That's not centralization, that's standardization. I think the two are very different. And then lastly, the chance to address inequalities in health outcomes properly, and to echo entirely what Owen has said, let's include all the relevant partners in this, so the schools, housing, finance, employment, and remember that we often see in healthcare the inequalities at the right to the far end of it when health inequalities manifest in disease. We need to make sure that the populations that don't engage in healthcare are encouraged to seek advice early on. And I think that's where we've got to focus some of our attention as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jag. That's thought-provoking ideas. Emma, would you like to share your perspective to kick us off?
So I'm as I say, a mental health lead. So I suppose for me, we are fortunate in Cambridgeshire that we've had permission to develop a mental health learning disability collaborative, which offers us, I think, the opportunity to both restructure a little bit and also to, undertake hopefully a revolution, which, as I say, is fantastic news. So I think first point would be around the same relationships. I think talking from on the ground, we've had some battles over the years with the acute hospitals. How do we really engage them in the mental health agenda? So, for example, our Cambridge University Hospital, Addenbrooke's, are developing a mental health strategy. How does that fit into our overall strategy? Of course, being a GP, I'll also highlight primary care. So we are now contracting PCNs within each PCN mental health lead sessions, because you have to remember, primary care are independent contractors. You can't just expect, I'm afraid, anymore, and with the workload volume, people need headspace time, contracted time to participate and really give the primary care voice, which mental health, of course, bearing in mind 90% of needs are managed in primary care. That's vital. And also the local authority, of course, too. So I think that's a real restructure, that it just allows that collaborative feel, people coming to meetings, taking ownership and leadership of their areas and really inputting together towards the system strategy. I think in terms of revolution, I would totally agree with Melanie. Digital, BI, public mental health, we've appointed a public mental health consultant. How do we really get the data analyst, the data there so that we can make a difference? Comms would be my other big one. We've relied for years on CCG comms, but actually having our own real mental health comms to get the messages out there, both from a patient perspective, but also in terms of what we're doing, service development, I think, and strategy is key. And pharmacy, would be another one, just on the ground, looking at the clinical box in our mental health collaborative. What does that look like? It's not just doctors, nurses, but also other roles like pharmacists, for example, and many others, OTs, that really make a difference in terms of mental health delivery. And finally, I would just comment on finance. So we're also thinking in resource, how do we make sure that the mental health collaborative gets its share of programme spend? We all know that things have improved massively, but still we've got some way to go. How do we make sure that that's ring fenced for us? And even in terms of staffing, how do the CCG staff come across that are our mental health management team, our clinical lead team? So really thinking, in order to give our collaborative teeth, we know that money is also important, and autonomy around that money. So how does that work? So that's my sort of third point, I suppose, around what I think is a great opportunity for mental health and learning disability. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. And the continual pressure for demand on mental health services, particularly with all we've seen through the pandemic, continues. Only last night I was talking with a friend who was pleading with the local crisis mental health services to take care of her son, who was 18 and seeking to commit suicide. The pressures are really real for our frontline services. So that's the context we're going into, and we know that as we go into the winter, things might only get tougher. Simon, it will be great to hear your perspective to kind of finish off contribution to kick off from each of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Alistair. I suppose the first thing I'd want to say is, yes, I absolutely agree that there's an awful lot we can change and need to change, but I suppose I see it more as a sort of evolutionary process rather than revolution. And I think I would slightly take issue with the way that Muir Gray sort of framed this about being the sort of third revolution for the NHS, because actually I don't think this is about just the NHS. It's absolutely about how the NHS, as Owen was saying, can work with all of the key stakeholders in a system to develop something that's different for that local population and respond to local needs. So I think very much around integration. It's the journey that we've been on now for a little while, and I think this is the next sort of logical step on that journey. Second thing I would just want to say, for those of you who are interested, the legislation around this, I think, is incredibly permissive in the way it is being framed, which means that there is real scope for local interpretation and much less of a sort of top-down prescriptive format that we tend to have seen in the NHS. And my third point, I guess, is a lot of the conversation is around what we can do at a system level around the integrated care system itself, but I think it's really important to recognise that this isn't just about what we do at a system level, it's just as much about what we do in local places, in neighbourhoods, using the primary care networks, so that we start to build things at a very local level from the bottom up. And that's where I think we'll get some real change and some real benefits. Thank you, Alistair.
Thanks, Simon. Well, thank you each panel member for your contribution. And just before we go to our first question from the audience, I just want to check, do any of you want to kind of comment or challenge on anything said by one of your fellow panel members so far? Okay, well, in which case, the first question that we've had in, I'd like Owen to address this first, and then perhaps Melanie, and then I think Emma would like to respond on this one as well. The question is, how can we work with public health to better define metrics that demonstrate the impact of a whole council integrated approach to the kind of wider determinants of health and population health? And I think it plays to your whole piece about whole council impact. And I'm also conscious that across the majority, but not all of East of England, we also have two-tier local authorities. So there is both county councils like your own, as well as district and borough councils making a key contribution on some of that agenda. So I'd be interested in your perspective about the kind of whole council bit, how it gets demonstrated as you see it. Perhaps Owen and then Melanie and then Emma could respond. That would be great.
So unfortunately, I don't have a magic answer of how to do this, but let's use some of the things that have worked so well during the pandemic in particular, that it isn't a great thing that the profile and reputation of public health has been so massively enhanced alongside the recognition that quite rightly we've seen throughout the NHS through the pandemic. Some of the highest profile figures in local government have been directed to public health. So as with most things in life, well, how do we do this? Let's talk to them. Let's get their views. Let's include the whole team in the public health team in some of these debates. But also, as I think was in the question itself, there's an interesting debate at the moment about what is the interaction between a health and wellbeing board and an integrated care partnership board. In some places, I would imagine they may well become one and the same thing. In other areas, depending on the geographies, that might not work, but we've got to find ways of not duplicating or competing. But some of this stuff we've been doing for years anyway, we just maybe haven't shone a light on it like this. So I would say let's just engage them in the debate, in the evolution of ICPs, so that they're not just grand talking shops or strategy setting things, but they're things that can help set priorities and shine lights on things that really do need shining on. One final comment is, let's also, though, be realistic about capacity, because as some of these mechanisms are being put in place, the proliferation of meetings where every single one of them says, oh, and we need the DPH there, the Director of Public Health, oh, and we need the Director of Adult Social Care. Let's just take a big step back and say, what is it we're trying to achieve, and make sure that the right people are at the right session and not get too hung up on hierarchies or stripes on sleeves and so on, because we just won't have the capacity to feed them all.
Thank you, Melanie.
Thank you. I know you don't want us to agree with each other, Alistair, on the panel, but I'm going to violently agree with Owen then. I think what I've just witnessed over the last 18 months, I've been reminded of all of the different skills that exist within within public health, including epidemiology, many different skills that they have as part of their training that makes people a public health practitioner, health promotion. And I believe that public health as a function needs to be absolutely central in an ICS, whether that's through the ICB, ICP, through the place alliances, wherever, mindful of their capacity as well. But it needs to be absolutely central, because the data and intelligence public health bring around knowledge of the communities, as well as the information that they gather every year as part of the JSNA, I think is hugely relevant to the work that ICSs will want to be doing.
Thanks, Melanie. Well, maybe to make it a bit more kind of granular, what about mental health? What about your view, Emma, on kind of the public health wider council contribution around mental health? What's your experience?
So I think it's absolutely key, and as I say, we're so excited that in Cambridgeshire we've appointed our first ever public mental health consultant, exactly because of this. So I think we also have to consider different levels of where we need public health input, and it must be underpinned by enough data analyst support. That's also where it goes wrong, because you've got to have the capacity to be able to extract the data and answer the questions that the public health team lead on. So we've learned that over the years. So I think, you know, for us, I mean, we will have input from public health and system data, looking at a mix of health and social care indicators, which might be anything from, you know, sort of accommodation issues to number of Section 136s, suicides. But we're also looking at developing PCN mental health dashboards. So I really want to involve my primary care colleagues, and the leads for those will be the PCN GP mental health leads, to actually own that data, to develop and co-produce those mental health data dashboards with us, and that will be supported by our public mental health consultant. And as I say, it might vary a little bit for each of our 21 PCNs because their demographies are quite different. So I think we have to think both at macro and micro level. And as I say, it's absolutely fundamental that we do have good public mental health input.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. But there's another question coming in, and perhaps I could link it to that, which is, do you think that primary care networks, and actually the whole of primary care, has got a big enough voice and profile in integrated care systems? I was talking only to some CCG clinical chairs on Friday who were saying, look, we have lots of GPs on our CCG boards. They feel very engaged, are up for it, and the legislation is permissive, but you know, where's the voice going to be in the future? And you mentioned it in your introduction, Simon, so perhaps we'll come to you after Emma.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Alistair, and it's really tricky. So it's the other issue that I think people forget is how many different representative bodies there are for primary care. So we have 6 locally, including our LMC, who are, can be quite militant about things, to, all our individual PCNs, to the practices themselves. So who does represent primary care? And this is why in mental health we've decided, and also, as I say, GPs are independent contractors, so they do have to be paid for their time. I don't think the PCN-CDs have enough time in their day, and not always, certainly for mental health, the passion, which is why we've ended up contracting the sessions directly from the mental health budget, which I think is the right thing to do. And of course, when you actually pay for something, it also really gives that symbolisation of ownership. We consider this important, and so far so good. So I think the primary care voice is absolutely critical. And you're right, Alistair, I think it hasn't been prominent enough, but it's also quite thorny in terms of the issues that it presents.
Simon, any views? Obviously from the region, you have a wonderful bird's eye view. Do you see enough of the PCN voice coming through?
I think it can come through, Alistair, and absolutely needs to come through. I think it is fair to say that we've probably spent quite a lot of time over the last few months focusing very much at the ICS level. And what I think we need to do is to really start working at around our places, and potentially the integrated neighbourhood teams, just as much as the primary care networks themselves. And I think it's in that more local level that we're likely to see both a need for a really strong primary care voice, but also an interest. And that's what I think the next part of the conversation needs to be for us. I would suggest over the next few months. I absolutely think we can get there. We need to get there, but I think we need to get down to real conversations at that more local level.
Thanks, Simon. A few more questions coming in. Pick up. There's a question about what might integrated care systems do for our staff, rather than we can kind of understand the logic for populations, but what about our staff? Maybe I could start with you, Melanie, and see if Jag wants to add anything as well.
I think this is a really good question, Alistair. I mean, I think for staff, I think back to the first wave in the pandemic when staff were deployed to work in single teams from all over the patch. And the feedback I heard very clearly from people was how rewarding it was working as part of a single team. And I think that's the ethos behind an ICS, that we're aligning people, not restructuring them, but aligning them to work as if they're in a single team with a common purpose. And I remember all too well the era that we've just been in, where the brutal contracting round within the NHS anyway was very adversarial, very combative, and definitely working in different sides, and even going to external arbitration, for example. You know, one of the hospitals in my patch went to, did that 2 years running, and it was absolutely really brutal for staff. So from where we have been to where I think we're going, it will be much more rewarding for staff. One of the challenges, however, is being clear on what that common purpose is, to bind everybody together into that single team, and also working in that way can be different, and it's important to ensure that staff feel that they have a sense of belonging as well, because that's the risk, that people don't see where they belong because they're working in a more fluid way as part of different teams. But I think it could be incredibly rewarding at an individual level.
Thank you. Jag, any particular views on this?
Thanks, Alistair. I'm just following on from Melanie's comments. I think there's an opportunity here for staff to be offered a much broader career trajectory, so they could rotate not just within their own institution but across the whole system and see different aspects of their patients' welfare. So looking back at my own career in neonatal practice as a newborn intensive care consultant, discharging the patient from the neonatal unit was just the beginning of that child's life, and being able to follow that up across the whole pathway of care, education, other needs. I think offering those opportunities to staff may well help us to retain staff as well as attract other staff. If we're careful and thoughtful about how we use digital technologies for remote working, we might even be able to attract staff from further afield and yet keep the cost base down for them. So I think there's an opportunity there to attract staff as well. And then the rotational piece, I think, is quite important. A number of colleagues I've spoken to have expressed their concerns about burnout and so forth over many years, and amplified by the pandemic, but not exclusively due to the pandemic. And having different opportunities across a year or two to work in a different part of the ICS might be a way to help keep those staff on our books, give them a different perspective, and help address their differing needs in terms of burnout and recharging their batteries as well.
Right, thanks. And Owen, clearly the workforce of people working across integrated care systems was hugely greater than just the NHS. But I'd be interested what your perspective is on this.
So exactly that point. I think there's a challenge, or there's an obligation on all of us as ICS leaders to recognise in our planning, in our language, just that variety that you talk about. And it's really easy to just use phrases like the workforce, and you're meaning the NHS workforce only, that just take care. As one example, there'll be hundreds, probably thousands of different providers and employers across our region. And so that gives us challenges around things like pay. And if a national pay agreement happens in one part of the system, say the NHS, but not in another part, local authorities to help fund carers, that gives a big challenge. In addition, different treatment of different parts of the system. So there's been a lot of coverage recently about mandatory vaccination in care home staff. And so I won't comment on the desirability of that as a policy, but it was stark that it was one part of an integrated system that was targeted on. We're having a consultation that's just about to end on the NHS staff mandatory vaccination. I think it's really important that if we're going to act as an integrated system, we act as an integrated system.
Absolutely, and I'm sure there'll be some voluntary community and social enterprise sector colleagues listening to this who'll probably say, and we probably employ more people than social care and the NHS do in some of our patches. So there is quite such a richness, as you say, Owen, and policy making nationally still can be in unfortunate silos. Emma, have you got a kind of mental health primary care take on this?
Really quickly, 2 points. So one is, I totally agree with what's being said. I think it's such an opportunity, and we're putting in place a training post to look at how do we offer our third sector staff, many of whom are absolutely wonderful but have limited career development opportunities. You know, if they want to become, say, a CPN or a social worker, how do they work within the trust to actually train up to do that, and looking at the apprenticeship type roles. So lots of opportunity. Workforce is a crisis, we all know, particularly in mental health, so we've got to think differently. And second example for me is, you know, we've now got a GP within our eating disorder service, and she has partly a clinical function but partly a strategic function, brokering the primary care secondary care interface, which for eating disorders has been quite a problem, and I think a lot of people will relate to that. And, you know, just having that split role just makes the job so much more sustainable, interesting, and keeps people going, I think. And whoever mentioned, I think it was Jag, about flexible, you know, just rotating. You know, we get feedback from junior doctors, nurses, all sorts of staff, how valuable that is. And it just prevents burnout and just keeps the interest, as well as understanding how other staffing groups work. So for me, it's a fantastic opportunity, and probably above all, the thing we have to focus on the most, because workforce is such a big issue.
And if I could just chip in, Alistair, if I may, just to echo another point, which is, I think it also gives colleagues who are new into the total system, and I completely echo Owen's point, that opportunity to look at the patient from multiple different sets of needs rather than their own little bit of the left leg or the right toenail or whatever it is, and just take the whole patient, which I think we talk about a lot, but in practice we are siloed in our approach. And I think making staff almost rotate through different perspectives of the health and social care and educational spectrum would be positive. I grew up in general practice originally, and I've never forgotten the value of that training, even when I turned into a hospital practitioner. And perhaps the last thing is, we talk a lot about variation of care for our patients and social care settings. We ought to, as Owen says, think a bit about variation of care for our staff groups as well. And that would be a good signal to send about standardising how they are treated across the whole of the workforce as a collective.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, interesting. I'd kind of like to move it on, perhaps staying a bit in that place by talking about a couple of questions around culture, and also how we build trustworthiness. And I just link them together because, to me, the ability to build trusting relationships and the right kind of culture across our integrated care systems is so critical. The ability to know that people have got best intentions, that you can truly challenge one another and challenge problems and issues, but you will always keep relationships more important than problems, is going to be critical. So one of the questions is, so how can you take that forward? How can you develop more trustworthiness in relationships and improve things in organisations? And I don't know if you want to kick us off on that one, Melanie, and I don't know, but if any of the other panel want to comment on it as well, I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Alistair. I think this is really important. As I said in my opening remarks, this is one of the key areas of focus, and what needs to continue to feel different about the way we work compared to, I don't know, the last 20 years I've spent in the NHS, for example. And the culture, I think, that I'm trying to create is one where compassion is at the heart, kindness, valuing my colleagues, both within my own organisation, but also across the wider system, both in health and care. And I think in terms of the trustworthiness as well, and I'm just following on from the last points as well, there is a great way of building better trust by understanding each other's challenges more, working in different parts of the system and understanding those perspectives, I think, is really key. Whether there's the opportunities to formally do that and to build it in as seconding or working as a single team. But I'm noticing it more in my own patch that people are moving around in the system more to get that different experience, and you just build up more understanding of the challenges that each other is facing. So that would be my response initially, and I'll just again give another plug as well while I've got the mic. I'm just loving reading the Michael West book at the moment on compassionate leadership, and I would recommend that to everybody as just a really fantastic read, really thought-provoking about culture, inclusivity, and kindness.
Thanks, Melanie, and couldn't agree more. We believe in evidence-based decision making and evidence-based clinical practice, and the evidence base for compassionate, inclusive leadership in the NHS is huge. But anyway, off soapbox. Emma, you wanted to make a quick comment on that one, I think.
So really, so we've had this problem. So when we set our primary care mental health service up initially, we've evaluated it with what's called a programme theory, and one of the issues was around trust between primary care and the secondary care teams. And what we learnt was how important it was in terms of communication, stating the obvious a little bit. But I think just to bring in the opportunity in some ways that COVID's provided here, because with the digital age, you know, MDT meetings, I know it's not the same as face-to-face, but they can actually be very successful. And we've set up virtual MDT meetings to discuss patients, primary secondary care together, liaison roles, and that's been really positive. Things have really moved on. And my second lesson for us around trust was around the leadership. So what we learnt was that, again, you know, we had to contract these GP mental health lead sessions to just give some balance between, you know, the primary secondary care ownership of the primary care mental health service in our case, but the lessons would be similar elsewhere. And also these joint roles whereby staff, so we've got a physical health worker for serious mental illness patients, the staff are employed by the GP federations, but they actually receive their supervision from the trust. And the eating disorder monitoring, which they also undertake, they spend half a day a week within the eating disorder service. So those relationships and just setting up that structure, not too difficult to do, but has really made a big difference. And I think that's what the ICS actually offers to promote, you know, that sort of real joint way of working.
Thanks, Emma. Simon, what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, thanks, Alistair. So I suppose I start from a perspective of saying, I think it's quite difficult to trust somebody that you don't know and don't really know. So actually that means you've got to spend time getting to know the people you're working with. And maybe it shouldn't amaze me, but it does still amaze me how often it's still the case. Even that teams from neighbouring hospitals don't necessarily know each other as individuals, and I'm absolutely sure that's the same in terms of, you know, does the hospital team really know the primary care team and the social care team? Again, possibly, but I think that's where I would start, is absolutely spending time getting to know the people you're going to be working with, and through that build that relationship, build that trust. As Melanie was saying, absolutely get to understand other people's perspective. And I guess, you know, the final bit of it is just, you know, do what you say you will do, because it's so easy to lose that trust if you say you'll do something and actually go and do something different. And then it takes a very long time, I would suggest, to sort of rebuild that trust.
Thanks, Simon. Yeah, as the old saying I always trot out on these occasions is, trust arrives on foot and leaves on horseback. It takes time to build it, and our integrated care systems, if they're going to truly succeed, we'll come in a minute to a question about and concerns you might have or anxieties you might have. But Jag, I think you wanted to say something about this culture, relationships issue.
Thank you. I think it's about focusing on trustworthiness, I think, rather than trust. I think trust is a summative event, if you like, and it's Simon's point around building trust takes time. And I think that the way that we can begin that in part is our behaviours, as others have commented, our track record, sticking to the promises we make and the commitments we give and delivering on them. And it's through those behaviours and modelling that you build up trust. Trust doesn't arrive, but trustworthiness is a trait amongst us. And a bit like Melanie, if I can make a small plug for Unara O'Neill's discourse on trust versus trustworthiness, and from a few years ago, I think there's a very good TED talk on it somewhere as well. For those that prefer to watch videos, it's well worth a look.
Thank you. So I want to come to one of the other questions now, which is, you know, what are the panel members' greatest apprehensions about ICS delivery and their perceived solutions? I mean, this is a big change in the system and the way it's supposed to work, and I think they're going to be apprehensions that people might have. So perhaps I could ask, you know, Owen and Melanie, perhaps what are your apprehensions to kick us off? If you have none and you're all relaxed, that's great. But Owen, do you want to go first?
So there's a couple of practical ones. I've already touched on them. That there's a lot of infrastructure that goes with it, and particularly in the forming norming stage, everybody's getting invited to 100 meetings. But far more importantly, I think it's an apprehension or not, I think it's an opportunity to really look beyond the transactional, because there's a risk that the integrated care boards could become dominated by performance management, particularly as you work so hard to catch up on electives and so on, but really drive on the transactional and take a scheme like discharge to assess. There are plenty of people who would say, well, what a wild success that's been. But we've got to make sure we're not only looking at things like that through the lens of speed of discharge or flow. The real questions I would love us to be getting into from an ICS holistic system perspective is, do we understand how people are recovering? Are we putting enough emphasis into support and medium-term care packages, so that we're looking to make sure that we're aiming to prevent admission as much as we are looking to prevent delayed discharge? And so I think that there's an opportunity for us to look more holistically at the person, not solely the patient and their presenting issue. But I do fear a bit that some of the infrastructure we're creating is ever more efficient ways of driving and holding to account performance, but only through a limited set of metrics, when we need to be looking at person-based and more medium term as well as short term.
Thank you. Always the danger in a system that you can become more efficient at doing the wrong thing. So effectiveness and efficiency are part of what we need. Melanie.
Thank you. This is whatever, however we describe it, revolution or evolution. It is a change, and at times it feels like I'm in a parallel universe thinking about this change, when actually faced with the day-to-day operational pressures, they're just overwhelming and huge for people and for the leadership as well. And one of my fears and concerns is that we do just go straight to, as Owen has just said, that we focus on the things that I'm worrying about, which are money, elective recovery, UEC, and that we do that and shortcut and revert back into how we would have tried to tackle those problems previously, rather than actually thinking, having a focus on those that are most deprived in our society and will also be affected by these three metrics, and that we look for solutions with our partners as well, with the district councils, with voluntary sector, with public health, and with the councils as well, so that our response to those three massive measures isn't as the traditional one. And that also takes a change in thinking and mindset, not just at system level with all of its partners, but at regional and national level as well. And that, I think, is where I'd just again end this response, which is my fear is that we won't get the support and the buy-in and the cultural change that's needed from other parts of the health and care sector, thinking particularly nationally and regionally.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Melanie. Just a quick reflection from Emma and then Jag, and then I'm going to ask Simon the question that some people have put, you know, are these new structures going to end up being given enough time to really make the difference? It'd be good to get your, as an experienced person in the health service, you know, and that view. But Emma and then Jag, apprehensions?
So 3. One is, you know, thinking about, again, my main experience being mental health and primary care, you know, how are we actually going to sort of hold people to account for delivery? How's that going to work? Make sure people do take ownership, because we all know that has to happen. There's a risk that nobody takes ownership. We're all integrated, collaborative, aren't we lovely? But actually, you know, there needs to be some kind of performance management type processes. Number 2 would be, again, primary care. You know, they're independent contractors. There is actually in existence a contract, but GPs are not going to put their houses on it. So there aren't good contract options for truly integrated solutions. And the 3rd one is headspace. You know, staff are so tired, you know, particularly again, you know, in primary care and mental health, you know, having the headspace to do transformation and really make this work also worries me. So they're my 3 worries offloaded, and I'm looking forward to hearing all the solutions.
Jag.
Thanks. I might share 3, partly covered. 1, will we have enough time to deliver some of the changes? And that is points to risk appetite, because sometimes we're going to get it wrong to start with, but will we have the patience to see it through? 2, how many policy changes will there be in the short to medium term that actually that derail the long-term ambitions? And 3, which is perhaps the most worrisome for me, which is some of the issues related to what Melanie said around inequalities for those that are the most disadvantaged. Are we going to, assuming there's a fixed cake to share, how are we going to make those difficult decisions around redistribution from those that might have a little bit more above average now to those that have quite a lot below average? Is there really going to be that give and take that's required if we're going to really raise the bar for everybody? I need to be convinced about that, I think.
Thanks. And actually, I think that would get us back into a whole conversation about whole councils and the wider determinants of health. And maybe we're going to come to that in a minute. But next up, there's a question there about whether the new ICS structures, new architecture will be given enough time to embed and make the kind of changes, including to culture, that are really needed. Simon, what do you think?
So first thing I say, I really, really hope that they will be given the amount of time. I think we've all invested a great deal in the creation of the ICSs, kind of at every level, so locally, regionally, nationally. I think in any regulated business, you kind of need to do enough to at least satisfy the regulators. And I think, you know, part of what we've got to do over the coming years is to work out just how much, where the bar is. And at a regional level, I think, you know, part of our role is to sort of put up a bit of an umbrella around the ICSs and protect them from, frankly, some of the nonsense that does go on from time to time, and I think we're really up for that. So we've got to do enough to satisfy so that we then get the amount of time to do the real transformative stuff that everyone's been talking about. And I think that the biggest thing I would personally come back to there is the workforce, because actually, when I look around at the moment, the thing that's probably going to be the most challenging, I think, is the workforce. We've got an enormous amount of health and care to deliver, and actually the workforce isn't there at the moment in the quantities that we would like, and therefore we've almost certainly got to get into the space around how can we redesign the roles, how we can integrate better, make it more interesting, staff passports, a whole range of things, and that's the thing that I think will probably make the biggest difference.
Thanks, Simon. And I think that's a great introduction. So there are a couple of questions people have actually asked about workforce, about, you know, whether and how you think integrated care systems might be able to broker and facilitate a workforce operating much more flexibly across not just health and care, but also thinking of housing, going across different parts of primary, secondary care, etc. So this kind of flexibility of workforce, bearing in mind we start from a position where historically there are very different terms and conditions and even pay rates, dare I say, for not that dissimilar levels of work across the different people. So what might we do about workforce that might help move that agenda forwards? I don't know if Melanie, you've got a comment. Owen, clearly, as you talked about whole council, but I'm sure the other panel members will have some contributions as well on this. This is probably our last question and maybe the most important, this whole workforce transformation challenge. Melanie.
I think the first thing I'd say is that systems have to plan their workforce together, and they can do that through what we now call our people boards. It's really important that we plan at system level, including social care, including the care market as well, because the challenges will be common. So that's the first thing to do, to try and find similar solutions. It's true that there are now greater attempts to enable that movement across systems, particularly, for example, between provider trusts at this stage through staff passports. But I also think at the moment we have so many differential levels of recruitment across our system. And I look to, in my patch, the best in class, and the best in class, which has 0 vacancy rate, and this is registered nursing, but just as an example, they have tackled that with a local solution. It's an area of great deprivation that can't recruit, but by involving local schools, local colleges, they've managed to create the conditions for this institution being much valued, much loved, and people want to come and work there. And they've used the local economy and the local profile to be able to fill their vacancies, and it's a huge success. So I think we need to just think about enabling staff to move about, but also enabling local systems to be able to recruit into the big gaps that some places also have.
Thanks. Well, as this is the last question, we'll pick up brief comments from every single panel member. But Owen, perhaps next, with a huge workforce in local councils.
Yeah, so it's massive and it's tricky. I'm not going to be able to answer it in a minute. So I'll just say a couple of things to prioritise are building greater understanding of the different challenges and influences on the workforce across the system. All of us demonstrating huge respect for the different sorts of roles. I think with the different terms and conditions, I'm not sure it'll be easy to just enable transferability, but one big shout out, there's a workforce that is not often talked about, and that's the workforce of unpaid carers. There's commentators much more qualified than me, Caroline Criado Perez, Sophie Walker, they always talk about this, that they are workers, they just don't get paid. And so we need to find a way of recognising that sort of unpaid carers, because without them, this system will fall apart.
Thank you. Great point. Emma.
So, yeah, my 15-second comment would be that we really, and we've been thinking about this a lot in mental health, need to move away from roles towards functions. So staff need to be competent, but one way of addressing differences in terms, pay, conditions, is actually looking at what functions we need to deliver rather than what somebody's role is. Obviously, we know people need to be, as I say, competent and trained, but we're masters of that really in general practice over the years, as you probably know, when we look at, the different sort of workforce we've developed. And as I say, there's much more of a focus on what functions people are doing rather than what roles or badges they have.
Thanks. Jack, do you want to say anything? And then Simon.
No, thanks. I think it's been said. It was about competencies rather than titles, and talk to local people and join it up to whether they can afford to live there.
Yeah. Simon?
Yeah, thanks, Alistair. I think for me, it's as much about how we treat staff, how they feel, how we make the East of England a great place for them to come and live and work.
Brilliant. Well, can I just thank you again, panel members, for each of your contributions. Thank you for all of you who've been watching, and please go and enjoy the glimpses of brilliance now and hear a bit about what your different integrated care systems are doing across the East of England, which is really encouraging and inspiring. So thank you, panel members, for your time. Thank you.